the recording, and I'm gonna let people in. Right.
Thanks, Michael.
Oh.
Morning, Jeff.
Good morning, and I'm sorry to say, who just said good morning to me?
Paul Stebbins.
Hi,
Stebbins.
Paul.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
I'm better in person, Paul. So welcome, Paul, and welcome. I see Sheila Smith, and I will not be able to acknowledge and welcome everybody by name, but we're so grateful. What a fabulous group at such a busy and shall we say challenging time. So I have 12 noon on the dot, and so I'm going to suggest that we begin, and Michael Kennedy admit others as they appear. I think you have that set up anyway, but thank you all for making time today. My name is Jeff Gedman with American Purpose, and my job is very simple today: to thank you for your time and interest in this conversation. What a fabulous group, as I've already said, rich in expertise and perspective. And Craig Kennedy and Michelle High will introduce our speaker, our conversation partner, Professor Agnes Callard from the University of Chicago. Michelle is our fabulous managing editor. Craig is senior fellow and senior advisor to me and to American Purpose broadly. Let's get the show on the road. Craig, may I turn to you?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jeff. One of the things that we've been trying to do at American Purpose is dig into what ails the American political process. And one of the things that comes up frequently is the extent to which anger seems to dominate so much of what gets said and done. Last November, we stumbled on a really interesting article by Agnes Callard that was part of a Boston Review forum, where she wrote a very provocative and insightful piece on anger from the perspective of a philosopher. We talked to her in December, way before the events of January 6th, and said, would you be willing to talk about the article and talk about what it might mean to American political life? As Jeff mentioned, Agnes is an associate professor at the University of Chicago. She's a very prolific writer, both in academic publications, but also in the New York Times, The Point, which if you don't read it, you should. It's actually a very interesting small magazine out of Chicago. And she always has interesting things to say about just about everything. So Agnes, why don't we kick it off with this? Why don't you start by just summarizing your piece on anger, and then Michelle, I'm sure will have more questions, and we'll get into the issue of how your framework, your ideas fit in with our current political scene.
And thanks to everyone for putting questions in chat.
Yes. Go ahead,
Okay.
Agnes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I'll summarize my piece, and then I'll say, I'm not really sure what the implications of that piece are for our current political situation. And part of the allure for me of coming here is the hope that at the end of this, I'll have a better grip on that. So I'm kind of counting on you to help me with that part. So here's the idea. In sort of contemporary academic philosophy, there's this sort of divide in how people think about anger. There's the people who think it's good and the people who think it's bad, roughly speaking, right? And the people who think it's good, it's a sort of philosophical tradition stemming from Aristotle, but really kind of bolstered by the kind of sentimentalist tradition of Hume and Smith and Hutchinson. And the idea there is that anger is our kind of like moral sense. It's almost like a smell that we have for when something is like right or wrong. And you take that away from people and like they don't have any ability to navigate right and wrong. The other side is the kind of Stoic tradition. It goes back really to Plato, but again, it's kind of its heyday, let's say, is in Stoicism. And there, the idea is that, look, anger is just a desire for revenge and a kind of affinity for an attachment to grudges, and we should get rid of it, and we should just like care about morality and justice without getting angry. And what I say is that if you kind of scratch the surface of what looks like an intractable philosophical divide, you actually find a substantive agreement if you look past the terminology, which is that the people who love anger, they don't love grudges and revenge, they love good anger. Good anger is where you just make moral judgments that are correct, right? And then the people who dislike anger, right? They don't want to get rid of that making correct moral judgments part, right? And caring a lot about making correct moral judgments. They're like, yeah, but we want that, but without the grudges and revenge. And the thesis of my piece is that you cannot separate the part that the thing we like about anger and the thing that we don't like about anger. And so this debate is kind of a faux debate, right? In which they're agreeing on something and the thing they're agreeing on is false. My argument that you can't separate the is that if you have a reason to be angry, you're in a situation where somebody, you take somebody to have wronged you. Let's say they really did wrong you, just to simplify it, so I don't have to say seems a bunch of times. So they did some action, right, that harmed you in some way. But they did it intentionally. If they didn't know they were doing it or they acted intentionally, then you wouldn't have reason to be angry at them, right? As much reason anyway. Which means they thought it was good. They thought that the thing that was bad for you was good for them. So they took your bad to be their good. Now, what revenge is taking that condition and making it kind of a law for your interaction with them and saying, well, now your bad is going to be my good. And that is to kind of enforce and hold accountable, right, this mindset that they applied to you. So that's the argument for revenge. Okay, and then what I sort of conclude by saying that there are a couple of philosophers who I think have picked up on this, but they haven't picked up on just how profound a problem it is. Because it looks like, on the one hand, if we don't get angry about injustice, then we're in some sense condoning it or permitting it. But if we do, then we're susceptible to these forms of irrationality that are just written into what anger is. And so there isn't something like a kind of pure moral response. And I conclude by saying you can't be good in a bad world. That's what the piece argues.
Okay. Michelle?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Callard. So can we start just looking at the rationality piece? Because you write, all right, quote, "It would be strange if one of the oldest and most universal human practices, revenge that was, did not have a rationalizing explanation," unquote. What about the flip the lid type of anger, where you get a hot flash of anger, you're seeing red, quote unquote, you hastily do something, you later regret it, and you come to regret it when your emotions have cooled down. So how is that type of reaction rational?
So I think that my piece doesn't argue that all anger is going to be rational, right? It argues, in effect, if it's true that you have a reason to be angry, then you have a reason to be angry forever and a reason to take revenge. But there might be cases where you have no reason to be angry in the first place, and you can recognize that. I think, though, that so essentially my piece doesn't cover the case that you just asked about, but I would extend it a little bit. So something that Aristotle says is that anger is like a hasty servant who listens to the beginning of your instructions, but then he runs away to do your bidding before he's listened to the rest of your instructions, right? And so that, which I think is a really interesting characterization, that the part of that I want to emphasize is there's always the bit of that the servant does listen to. So I think every time you're angry, there is some kind of rational thought inside of your anger. That is, anger isn't like fear, which can just be a kind of panic reaction and not have any rational content. Anger is a reaction where it always makes sense to ask, why are you angry? What are you angry about? And people tend to have something they can say. Now, it might be something that they later judge to be a bad reason, or I shouldn't have been angry about, or whatever. But it's really interesting in kind of having this built-in cognitive content to it. The bit that the servant did listen to, right? So I think, which is not to say it's rational, full stop, because again, you might say, all things considered, like, I shouldn't have been angry about it. It wasn't his fault. He didn't know, or whatever, right? That would be a case where you don't have a reason to be angry forever, because you never had a reason to be angry in the first place, though you believed that you did.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So taking then that there's always a rational piece, can we get at the apology part? And the part that you always have a reason to be angry. So quoting you, quote, "Those facts were your reasons to be angry. In other words, the reason why you got angry, the thing that the person did wrong to you doesn't change, and therefore you always have a reason to stay angry." Isn't it plausible that part of the reason we're angry is because we have a desire for dignity, for recognition as equals, and that's been trampled? And that's why we crave that apology. And when we get that sincere apology, we actually do feel better.
Yeah, I think that quite often apologies work. But there's a question, okay, what is it? How do we analyze the case where they work, right? Here's the thing that I don't think is right. I don't think that anger is the desire for an apology, right? Like, first of all, anger isn't a kind of desire, I think. Aristotle thinks it is. I'm disagreeing here. Aristotle thinks anger is essentially a desire for revenge. I do think angry people want revenge, but I wouldn't define anger that way. I think it implicates a desire for revenge. But I don't think it's like in effect, it would be weird to say, what I'm angry is that this wrong has been unapologized for. And then when it's apologized for, it's like, oh, my desire was satisfied, right? Well, there's a reason you want an apology. There's a reason why you feel your dignity has been wounded, which is that there was some wrong, right? And you experience that wrong as an affront to your dignity. And it may be that, like, the apology, makes you feel better in some respect in relation to your dignity, right? And now you just don't care anymore that wrong was committed. Probably you still think it was a wrong, right? I mean, that is, we want to distinguish real apologies from not real apologies, right? And not real apologies tend not to admit wrongdoing. I'm sorry if you feel bad or something, right? In effect, not real apologies don't acknowledge the reason to be angry in the first place. And real apologies acknowledge the reason to be angry. So in effect, there's something magical and paradoxical about apologies, which is that it's someone's full acknowledgement of my reason to be angry that makes it possible for me not to be angry anymore, right? But I really think that is how it works. And that it's the other person's unwillingness to acknowledge your reason that makes you cling to it. So I think that's the functioning of apology. But does any of that suggest that after the person has apologized, you no longer have a reason to be angry? No, you do have a reason. You have the very same reason that you always had. And maybe that you're no longer angry, right? So you're no longer responding to that reason to be angry with anger. But the reason is still there. It's the wrongdoing.
So, Agnes, let's turn to contemporary politics which I think is one of the reasons we have so many people who showed up today. Especially after the events of last week, there's a lot of calls for people to curb their anger, restrain it, seek reconciliation, maybe not forgive and forget, but to tamp down these strong emotions that are riling our political process. How does your framework apply to that? I mean, you would seem to say, hey, listen, you can ask people to park their anger all you want. It's not going to work.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about that over this past week. So the first thing is that just as a psychological matter, like I would predict that telling people not to get angry is not a very effective thing to say. We could all see that from interpersonal cases where you're angry at your spouse and they're trying to like just tell you to calm down, and that tends to just make you more angry, right? So I don't see it as a very effective form of political speech. I see it as kind of like, I mean, obviously it depends on the instance, but it can often be almost like a kind of bullying. Like you're not allowed to be angry anymore, right? Or any way to be experienced as such. I see a lot of the opposite too. So I don't only see the thing you're saying, which is like calls for calmness and unity. I see things like, accountability is the true unity, and like lots of calls for punishment. And in fact, I even see something else, which I feel like is at least well accounted for in my speech, which is a lot of people are taking great pleasure in these cases where certain of the people from the insurrecting mob have gotten punished in one way or another, have gotten caught, right? So I see people taking great pleasure in that, really enjoying the suffering of those people. That, I mean, let's say that from a Nietzschean angle, that's very intelligible, right? Because Nietzsche thought that, in effect, our institutions of punishment exist to serve our desire to enjoy the suffering of our fellow man, which we restrain and curb under other circumstances, right? But here's a case where we're allowed to enjoy people's suffering, and people really do seem to enjoy it and sort of indulge in it, right? So, this would be one way I would think of is like framing the call to unity is like, to what degree are we going to permit ourselves to indulge that desire to enjoy the suffering of others? How much suffering do we need to exact as a penalty? Who will we be, like, as a people, if we take pleasure in that? So that's another way to frame the call to unity, is to sort of see that at least some of the desire for punishment is an occasion to take pleasure in the misery and suffering of other human beings.
So we're starting to get some questions coming through. Send them on chat, or if you want to ask them directly, let me know. One that's come through basically asks about the role of social media platforms to manufacture anger and escalate it at a massive scale. I guess I'd be interested in what you think about that. I mean, do we have a responsibility to not let others provoke us when the wrong really doesn't exist? Maybe fake slights, fake whatever. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of complex. There's a lot of complexity to this playing out on social media that I haven't thought through. I think no one has thought it through yet. Because essentially what social media is like, it has presented us with a set of new coordination problems that human beings have never faced before. And we keep sort of flunking these coordination tests because we don't know how to do it, because it's new, right? And so then there's a lot of panic about social media, like, it's terrible, it's ruining us, it's ruining humanity, right? Because it's like a kind of freedom we haven't had before. And one response human beings have to freedom is like, let's have a little less of it because we're going to screw it up, right? And maybe we are going to screw it up. But I feel like that's part of it, is that there's a vast coordination problem issue. And one bit of that coordination problem is the coordination of emotions. And so one thing that happens on social media, say on Twitter, is like, it's hard to distinguish human beings from non-human beings. And I don't just mean bots, but yes, bots too. Like, it's hard for your humanity to come across on Twitter. I mean, those little profile photos are pretty important, like that there's a face there, it's like, oh, okay, this looks like a person. It's a face, right? It's easier for us to see a person as a person when they're a face, but it's even easier for us to see a person as a person when they're expressing an emotion. So part of what happens on social media is that people feel a need, and in fact, I believe the need exists, to perform their humanity, right? So to be performatively human, where that a lot of what that means is to have emotions and to be emotional, right? So I think we need to be emotional on social media in order to see one another as human. And now there's a question, okay, but like, how do we do it? And how much are we allowing the way that those emotions are getting performed to be sort of like guided and dictated by other people? And how much are we like conforming, in a sense, to others? I think quite generally people conform to other people kind of all the time in like almost every way. So this is not like a weird outlier, but that's why I was mentioning the thing about coordination problems. This form of conformity is new and like kind of scary. I think, like, I agree with you. The way you put it is that these are fake emotions. And I think a lot of the emotions on social media are fake emotions in the sense that they are performed, where what I sort of mean by that is just like a lot of what we call political anger. If you measured people's heart rates, they wouldn't be that high, right? So Aristotle said one of his other definitions of anger is the boiling of blood around the heart, right? And you get why he thinks that, because when you feel really angry, it feels like your blood, like right around your heart, is like, you feel your blood pressure go up. And so I think a lot of what we're calling anger in the context of politics, like nobody's blood pressure is actually raised. For some people, but like the vast majority of people that are angry, like, are in some sense performing anger. And for the sake of, in some sense, being human in public. And so anyway, what I want to say is that that's part of this larger coordination problem. And I guess I don't think the answer is, let's not be emotional in public, or let's not be emotional on social media. That would have a huge cost, I think, to to the larger social media coordination project.
Well, I'm sure both Michelle and I have some questions we'd like to ask, but I'm getting an amazing number of questions here. So I'm going to start calling on various people, not necessarily in the order that they got into me, but by what looked like interesting questions. So let me start with Aaron Sibarium. Aaron?
Hi, thank you so much. My question, so it seems like the thesis that you lay out, Professor Callard, is that it is in some sense morally rational to be angry in a lot of cases. Mm-hmm. But right now, it seems like each side of our politics essentially has good, valid reasons to be angry at the other side. But if each side acts on those reasons, each is presumably going to give the other side more reasons to be angry, and it will just sort of perpetuate a polarization cycle. So I guess my question is, might depolarizing society require us to ignore some of these moral reasons and in a sense behave in a morally irrational way?
Good. So I say in the piece that we often have reason to be angry, right? And thus that anger is rational. I stand by that. But I don't say that even in those cases, anger is the only rational response, or that we are rationally required to be angry, right? Like, I think I think the eternal anger argument is valid, basically. So I think if you have a reason to be angry, you have a reason to be angry forever. That is, I've struggled with it. Like I've gone back and forth on that one, but like at least most of the time, I just think that's a good argument. Its conclusion is true. That doesn't mean you should be angry forever, right? It doesn't mean you're rationally required to be angry forever. It means you have a reason. You have other reasons too. So, you know, what you're bringing out is there are reasons to not be angry, and we should respond to those reasons, at least to some degree. Now, maybe if I can say something slightly longer in response to this question, because this is sort of an occasion to think about sort of like broadly, like what are the political implications? What should we do? Rereading my piece, the one line that jumped out at me, like if I were going to cut a line from this piece, was I say something like, I think people should sometimes get angry. And if I could rewrite the piece, I would rewrite it just without that sentence. It's not that I don't think people should sometimes get angry. I think I wrote that line because I didn't want people reading it to think my view is people should stop being angry. And that was my way of saying that. But I don't know if people should stop being, what do I know? Like that's not, I don't know how angry other people should be. And I think in general, like maybe we're a little too inclined to think we know how angry other people should be. What I think though is that, you know, with any particular situation where one could be angry about it or one could not be angry about it, and I think almost some ways both of those options are rationally open to us. There's a good and bad way to do each of those things. And the mistake is to think that you've chosen the good route just by choosing between the two, right? So the angry people think by being angry and by being on the right side, I'm having the correct response to the situation. And the people on the other side of the anger also think that. And then the non-angry people are like, they're sometimes the most sanctimonious and annoying, right? They're like, I can see past these, you know, political divides that consume the lower kind of human that gets angry, right? And I'm above that, and I'm rational and calm. And those people have a kind of contempt, right, for the angry people. And I think that's a mistake. That's a bad way to not be angry. So there are bad ways to not be angry is like an important, I think, moral of the story here. There are also good ways to not be angry. And there are bad ways to be angry and good ways to be angry. And the fact that there's some injustice and that you're either responding to it or looking past it, that doesn't tell you that you've done things well. And so I suppose I think the question is, what are the pitfalls and virtues of both sides of getting angry and of not getting angry? And I think that the pitfalls of getting angry are a tendency not to realize how much you've become like the other side. Angry people are always morally implicated in the evil that they're opposing, and they are bad in the way that the people that they're opposing are bad. And that's part of what I'm arguing. That's just true of you if you're angry. You should understand that about yourself, that you're morally corrupt. I think that if you are not angry, like you're choosing not to be angry, you've somehow managed not to be angry about injustice, like what you've decided to do is blind yourself to a wrong, and you've insulated yourself from some sorts of evils, right? But at a huge cost. And you should not think that you're somehow occupying the high ground or that you're justified in having contempt for those who are angry. And in a way, you should respect them and see them as your moral guides because they can see more than you can, right? So I guess I would say that for me, like it's the biggest moral is that the mistake is to think that it's in choosing between getting angry and not getting angry that we've made the fundamental choice about how to respond correctly.
Okay, so we've got a ton of people that are have questions. I'm going to start with Jay Tolson, and then I'm going to go to Nicole Penn, and then Paul Levy, and then Michael, roughly in that order, and we'll see how much time we have left at the end of it.
Can we try to get David Crane in there?
David Crane, okay, we'll put him after Nicole Penn.
Okay, thanks.
Jay, you're on mute.
I'll cede to David Crane if, he's been
No,
waiting.
go ahead, Dave. We'll get David in.
Okay, now, very quickly, I'm not a political philosopher, but lately there has been a lot of writing about agonistic politics among political philosophy circle thinkers, particularly, I think, somebody like Chantal Mouffe, and to some extent, I think this is an attempt to save agonism in politics from the bad name that Carl Schmitt, the Nazi apologist, gave to it, the sort of need for friends and enemies in politics. And I think there's a sense in which if there is a positive legacy to Trumpism, it's that it has reanimated a kind of passion in politics, and including anger. But the question, I think, in agonistic politics discussions is, can you preserve a framework, particularly a constitutional democratic framework, once the sort of the furies of the passions have been unleashed in the way we've witnessed? Or is there this sort of, to echo Arendt, is this sort of classical ideal of the politics as being the arena where frank speech can and should take place? Is the assumption of that kind of classical politics impossible to hope to build in the kind of mass democracy that we have now? Because again, the underlying norms might be absent. And so I asked that question in relation specifically to the role of anger.
Yeah, great. Okay. I'm gonna try to be efficient in answering so we can get through more questions.
Sure.
Sorry
sure,
if that
no.
also means I'm not. So I think that one way to think about politics, or at least like let's say governmental politics, is that it is about the allocation of scarce resources in one way or another, right? It's an alternative. You can think of markets as automatic allocation of scarce resources, right? And politics is like deliberative allocation of scarce resources, where there's a kind of conversation about how to allocate the resources, right? Markets are mute. The invisible hand is also inaudible. And so then there's this question, like, how do we do that allocation? And I think one way to do it is kind of, let's say, via collaboration and compromise. And a distinct way to do it is adversarially, where you have the sense that like the interests of your allies are good, but the enemies, like you actually want them not to get what they want, right? So you don't. It's not a plus for you if the other side gets something of what they want. That's the collaborative spirit. The adversarial spirit says like, no, I want their ends to be frustrated. And so that, agonism is the adversarial spirit in politics. It's the idea that we're not like, in some sense, all out for the common good. Actually, some of us are out to screw others of us. And that's, you get, the need for friends and enemies. And I think in that context, you get a lot of passion, and you do get a lot of moral discourse and moral rhetoric, because what really, the political arena then becomes a place in which people like accuse their enemies of being evil and wrong. And I think I see a lot of value in that in principle, because in principle, it's very philosophical, much more philosophical than the like, let's figure out how to distribute goods in a way that benefits everyone. It's incredibly destructive too. The thing that makes it the unphilosophical, I think, ultimately, is exactly the thing that you adverted to at the end about the larger forum, which is that the people don't tend to be speaking to one another, the people who oppose one another. So what we have is debate. In a debate, the debaters are never speaking to one another. They're each speaking to their audience, right? And they're each trying to get as many people on the side as possible. That's very unphilosophical, right? Debate is a fundamentally unphilosophical mode of communication, contra the way a lot of people who are touting free speech like talk. They tend to like elevate debate as though it were a good thing. It's not a good thing from a philosophical point of view. So the real problem, as I see it, is that the agonistic spirit devolves into debate instead of a truly philosophical approach, which is refutation, which I could go on about, but I won't.
Okay, David Crane.
Sure. Thank you, Agnes and everyone. I guess my original question, I think you answered when you brought up heart rate and high blood pressure. I guess I was wanting a little clearer picture from you about what anger is. Is it a state? Is it like how? But then maybe, but you did say that, you know, just because you have a reason to be angry doesn't mean that it necessarily follows you will be angry. So I guess a second question then that I might have about the argument in your paper is for the argument for revenge about converting the sort of particular circumstance into a law of interaction between parties. I'm just wondering why that's an ethical thing to do, to turn it into a law. But so those are my questions.
Good. Maybe I'll just say something about the last thing. That's the last bit is like a really good question. I feel it's under argued in the piece. And I think it's that, you know, like there's a question like, what would it be to respond to anger in a principled way? Like if you hurt me, right? And now I want to respond to you in some way that's principled. In a certain sense, the idea of law is the idea of that. It's the idea of having a principled kind of response, right? Having a response that is regulated by a structure that generalizes across circumstances. And so in effect, if I'm right that revenge is a way of creating a kind of legalistic framework in your own soul for how you respond to the other person, then that just is what a principled response would look like, as opposed to something like an arbitrary response.
Okay, Nicole Penn, please.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask about the role of limitations of knowledge in this. I think the part of your essay that I really loved was actually the last line: we can't be bad people, we can't be good people in a bad world. And I think that speaks to really starting to skirt into a certain Christian framework that I wonder where you know, you are angry because someone wronged you, but there's a limitation to your knowledge of like why that person wronged you, and that wouldn't that then transfer to, you know, the remedy that you seek. So is there a way, and maybe you've sort of been touching on this, you know, is there a way to be angry and acknowledge that restitution is the right way to go, but that restitution, as you ably pointed to in your piece, is never going to undo the fact that this person shouldn't have wronged you in the first place, but you are not the perfect judge of what a good of what the restitution should look like. And so a little bit of humility on your end is necessary because of these limitations of knowledge. And I'm wondering if you might want to draw this into, we've been talking a lot about the events of January 6th, but the slate of executions that have been happening recently at the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court, I think, waived and whatnot. I'd be really interested in hearing your view on that.
Yeah, I read the story of the woman, I can't remember her name, who was executed, who had been abused as a child. It was just tragic. Like, it made me so sad. That was my only response. But the idea of humility there, I think humility is such a much more tricky concept than people realize. That is, I think there's an inclination to think that you can take any attitude that you have and then sort of like put humility sauce on it, and that kind of dampens it, right? And so it's like, we're like, just be a little bit humble about it. Like, it's almost like just pull back, right? And I think that you're absolutely right that the angry person is like not in a position to know a bunch of things. If I'm right, anger corrupts your mind. I actually think it's a kind of like psychological injury. So like, you're messed up if you're angry, you're injured, right? Even if you're angry correctly. And that means you're a bad judge, right? But it also means that you can't see that you're a bad judge, and you can't see it even by pouring humility sauce on it. Like, you really can't see it. It's like a deep fact about you, right? There isn't some other you that's like totally calm and not angry that gets to pour the humility sauce over it, if you see what I mean. And so I think the way that that neediness manifests is actually that you like need the other person to help you think through the situation, at least in cases of interpersonal anger. This doesn't go as well for politics, and I'm not sure how we think about this at a political level, but it's like, if I'm angry at my husband, that's the situation in which I least understand how to treat him, like in the sense of understand it by myself. I kind of need his help. And this is the big paradox of anger, is that the person whose help you most need to think through the situation is the one you least want to talk to and least want to let help you, right? But I think that like, I suppose I think that there's almost like a kind of arrogance in thinking that humility would solve that problem, because it suggests I could solve it on my own. And my whole problem is that I can't, is that in being angry, I can't think through the situation clearly, including not being able to think through the fact that I can't think through the situation clearly. And so anger really requires this kind of human interaction where the other person, like, yes, they shouldn't have done it, but they can explain to you the circumstances they were in. And now you suddenly start to see it differently. And you couldn't have started to see it differently before they did that. You couldn't have started to see it differently just by thinking to yourself in the abstract. There could have been things that might have explained why they did this, right? You needed them to actually explain the actual reasons why they did.
Great. So here's the, I think, last 4 questions. We're going to start with Paul Levy. Then we're going to go to Sheila Smith, then Michael Polyakov, and we'll end with Bill Galston. Paul.
Well, I threw out a bunch of comments on there, but a general question. Could you frame this in any way in the context of religious belief and how the religious views might stand beside the philosophical views? I'm thinking, for example, about, the concept in Judaism of Yom Kippur, which is all about forgiveness, apology, and moving on, as just one example. I'm sure there must be others in a variety of religions.
Yeah. I think that one thing that's really important about Yom Kippur is that it combines the forgiving of others with the being forgiven, right, by God. That is, there's, I do think that it's possible to sort of like, really like something like decide to adopt a point of view on the world in which you see yourself as sort of like among the sinners. And I think that Yom Kippur, we're called upon to adopt that point of view. And there's something quite important about the fact that it's like a temporally limited like event, right? And the idea here, I think, in a way, is to counteract the argument from grudges, right? It's like, well, if we got Yom Kippur going once a year, then at least our grudges are going to last more than a year. Not that it works for all Jews. There are definitely Jews who hold grudges longer than a year. But I do think that is one way. And in a way, Yom Kippur acknowledges the argument from grudges. In that way, it acknowledges that we have these grudges that we've been holding on to, right? And makes it somehow easier to get rid of them because we have to see that we are asking the same thing of others. I think that that is quite different. Like in a way, Christianity, it's almost the way I'm not Christian, so I probably have a bad image of it, but the way I imagine it is almost like Yom Kippur every day of the year, where like, you're supposed to try to be like Jesus, who was perfect, right? And that, like, for me, that's like the main line of Christianity is like, be ye therefore perfect, right? It's like, that's a crazy thing to ask of people, right? But I think that Christians feel called to that. And I do wonder how anger is compatible with Christianity. And I see the tension over that in like the writings of Martin Luther King, like where it's really, really very important. You see the religious point of view in sort of his philosophical approach to interventions against injustice, where it has to be very clearly like, there has to be this very clear demarcation. It's not just nonviolence. It's like, in a deep way, non-aggression, I think, that's guiding the thinking there. So I see the Christian sort of impulse as, in a sense, being something like in the Stoic direction.
Okay. Sheila Smith, please.
Thank you so much. This has been a fabulous conversation. I just want to confess at the outset, Agnes, I am not a political philosopher. So I'm coming to this as somebody very observant of what's going on. I'm in DC at the moment, but also somebody who studies another culture's politics. But I wonder in the conversation, one thing that struck me that I wanted to ask you to address, and that is how we get our minds around individual anger, right? How we experience it, our context for it, and collective anger. And this goes kind of to the root of this question of our democracy and how it works. It's a majoritarian system, right? There's always somebody out of power or in the minority. So in the collective, you may have the same causes that you and others have spoken about, the sense of harm, indignity, inequality that an individual might experience. But there's also this other dynamic, this collective political dynamic, I'll just call it disenfranchisement for the moment, the sense that your voice is not heard, that you are outside the majority. And leaving aside whether the events of the Capitol last week represent that sentiment or not, or that sense or idea of anger, it does seem to me we have to kind of figure out what this disenfranchisement might mean for people who want to use anger to mobilize collective action. And so again, it's not a very clear philosophical question, but the line is between our individual expression and experience with anger and collective expression. Thank you.
Good. That's a great question, because it sort of points back to the thing that Michelle asked me about dignity, right? And that, like, look, sometimes we're angry over some injustice, and then the consequence of that is we feel that our dignity has been wounded and we feel that we have not been fully respected. But sometimes it's more like we feel on a fundamental level that our dignity has been wounded and we've not been respected, and we're almost like finding injustices to a little bit pin that on or something, but the crucial part is the dignity part. I do think that we have a very profound commitment to equality in this country, like where it's very easy for things to be conflicting with that. So the question is, how do you not have a situation in which whatever group of people is in some sense not ruling and the thought would be your interests are being taken to heart even by the people on the other side. But I think the more agonistic government becomes, the more disenfranchised the people who are not in that majority group are going to feel.
Great. Okay, Michael.
Yeah, this has been wonderful, Professor Callard. I hope we can continue the conversation. My mind turned to a couple of other thinkers, notably Johann Huizinga's book Homo Ludens, The Play Element in Culture. And Paul got me started on this thinking when he raised the issue of Yom Kippur, how important ritual and religion are as a solution. Plato's Laws, I've always loved this mysterious passage. Man must be serious with the serious and not the other way around. God alone is worthy of supreme seriousness, but man is made as God's plaything, and that is the best part of him. And the Greeks really seem to have gotten it, that you can have an outlet, a vicarious safety valve in the agon, in contest. And that actually can eliminate a lot of the terrible pressures. That this is not Carl Schmitt's horrific friend-foe principle. It's a way of actually addressing this with a certain amount of human humility. And I'd raised the the point about Aeschylus Oresteia, which is of course the great warning about what happens when people exercise their quite justifiable anger and desire for revenge. And even the gods screw it up. They can't solve it until it's solved in a law court. And it's not as if everybody's going to be happy with that solution, but from the point of view of society, it means that we're not ripping at each other's vitals, our own vitals, that we're avoiding stasis to the best of our ability. So those were the completely incoherent thoughts that I wanted to throw out.
Thank you. First, I'm grateful to you for teaching me how to pronounce Hoinziga, which when you said it, I'm like, who's that? And then I'm like, oh, it's the play guy. I never knew how to say his name. So I think that, so like one thing is you're right to notice that like anger is a tightly regulated emotion for everyone. Okay, we need almost like we need an occasion to be allowed to have it, right? So you could almost imagine everybody as like waiting until they have an excuse to get angry. Like we're waiting for reasons to get angry, right? And there's a kind of energy that we want to release, but we feel you're only allowed to release it under certain very special circumstances. And part of it is the more we constrain those circumstances, the more intense the anger is going to be when it comes out under the circumstances, right? Now you might think, you know, maybe something like play could be an alternative. I mean, you know, if you think about the way Hoinziga talks about play, like part of what's important there is exactly that it is, you know, though it's extremely absorbing, it is disconnected from the world of like profit and gain and like, in some sense, serious work, right? And it has sort of like its own rules that are separate from the rules of the outer society. And I just think that that's not going to satisfy a lot of what people want out of anger, in the sense that they precisely what people get out of anger is a feeling that they are in touch with the deep moral structure of the universe, of what is the opposite of play. Right. And if you look at the Oresteia, how does it end? It ends in the law, in the sort of establishing of law as a way to contain anger, not play, right? Where there's this kind of the reality of an institution comes into place to acknowledge the moral law in such a way that revenge is no longer constantly required, right? And so I think if you want to know, like, what is the ideal way to sort of manage injustice, I think the answer is the law. That's why we have law. But the problem is that the law somehow doesn't satisfy us. Like we want extrajudicial kind of moral reckonings. And I'm sort of doubtful that something like play would satisfy us just precisely because it is not, because of the way in which it's separate from real life.
Well, we're flawed creatures, and that's part of the challenge, that we have to do the best we can with the imperfect nature of our souls.
Yes. Apologies to all of the people who have asked questions that we haven't been able to get to. This has been an extraordinary conversation with some really wonderful insights. I'm going to give the final word and final question to Michelle High.
Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you so much, Professor Callard, and thanks to all the questions, which is what has made this such a great event. So if you don't mind, let's just finish by thinking about the role of philosophers in the public square. Obviously, you wrote this piece in 2020. You know, current events were not front of mind, but you've written a piece using words like justified, rational, and intelligible for anger. And we're in the midst of watching anger unfold in a pretty dangerous way. We've seen the word justified alongside the word rage with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I'm wondering, should it be the role of public philosophers to point out arguments that guide us away from perpetual anger and violence?
It already is the role of some public philosophers to do that. Martha Nussbaum does that. I don't see that as my role. I think not because I think it's a bad thing to do, but because I am still in the stage of figuring out what we should do. And for me, public philosophy is part of that. That is, when I'm doing public philosophy, it's not because I want to tell the public what to do or how to think. I would totally do that if I thought I had knowledge, like 100%. I would give it to you all, and I'd be like, here's how you have to live. Maybe someday. I'm working my way to that. But what I think instead is that I have a bunch of thoughts that are sort of somewhat thought through. And on some points, I've thought things through further than other people, but I haven't brought them to completion. And this piece ends with me kind of being like, I don't know, what the consequence here is, but I think that, one thing I think is we should stop pretending like there's this pure anger out there. I just think that's a lie we've made up to make the situation look better for ourselves. And we shouldn't do that. So that's one role for public philosophers, is to tell us when we're deceiving ourselves, because I think ultimately deception is not sustainable. That is, forms of public discourse that involve a kind of pleasant lie will get exposed eventually, and it will be ugly. The exposure will be ugly. And so, the job of philosophy, I think, is just to help us try to tell the truth to ourselves, where that then involves the other person doing that too. If you don't know the whole truth, if I knew the whole truth, I would give you that, but it involves other people telling me the truth as they see it, right? So that we can proceed to something like knowledge. So I guess that's what I see as the goal, is like having something like knowledge. And then if I had it, I would share it.
Thank you so much. I'm heartened by seeing so many people connected to the world of DC politics and policy here to listen to a great philosopher from the University of Chicago speak. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks to everyone who asked really insightful questions.
Yeah, it was great.
Thanks for including me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you, Agnes.
Thanks.
It was terrific.
Lovely.